A breath of wind sweeps across the endless steppe, raising a light dusting at the very foot of the ancient hills. The sun has not yet fully awakened, but its first, barely noticeable rays are already painting the horizon with delicate shades of pink and gold. Where heaven and earth meet, where ancient stones preserve the echoes of millennia, lies a city whose name has become synonymous with holiness and eternal struggle, Jerusalem. What comes to mind when we pronounce this word? Perhaps the echo of prayers reaching back through the depths of time, or the glint of gold on the tops of majestic buildings that seem to touch the sky itself. Or perhaps the rustle of the robes of high priests walking along cobbled streets, where every stone remembers the touch of the feet of prophets and kings. This city is more than just a dot on a map. It is the heart of the world, pulsing with eternal history, a place where the heavenly touches the earthly and myths take on flesh. Imagine a morning when the air is still cool and fresh, filled with the scent of herbs and the distant sea. The light slowly spreads across the valley, revealing from the shadows the silhouettes of hills and the outlines of walls that for centuries served not only as protection, but also as a symbol. This dawn is more than just the change from day to night. It is the dawn of a new era, the prelude to momentous events that will forever change the course of history. Jerusalem at the zenith of its glory. It is more than just a majestic city. It is a center of strength, faith, and power. Here, under the shining sun, the destinies of nations are intertwined, great plans are born, and the divine will is fulfilled. The air is filled with the anticipation of something grand, something transcending the ordinary. This is a time when dreams of greatness take shape, and faith becomes an unshakable foundation. Think of how many generations of people lived, loved, suffered, and hoped in these lands. How their aspirations, their prayers, their battles merged into a single fabric of history, woven from pain and joy, from failure and rebirth. Jerusalem is a living chronicle of the human soul, etched in stone and in memory. In this morning light, when the shadows still stretch long, and the sounds of the city are just beginning to awaken, we stand on the threshold of a great narrative. A tale of a city that became a dream come true, of a people whose faith was forged in trials, and of a time when the world stood on the threshold of miracles. This is a story that began with dawn, with the first glimmer of hope illuminating the ancient hills of the Holy Land. And this dawn, bright and promising, marked the beginning of the journey we begin to explore today. Light slowly spreads across the valley, revealing the silhouettes of hills and the outlines of walls that for centuries served not only as protection, but also as a symbol. This dawn is more than just the change of day and night. It is the dawn of a new era, the prelude to momentous events that will forever change the course of history. Jerusalem at the zenith of its glory. It is more than just a majestic city. It is a center of strength, faith, and power. Here, under the shining sun, the destinies of nations are intertwined. Great plans are born, and the divine will is fulfilled. The air is filled with the anticipation of something grand, something transcending the ordinary. This is a time when dreams of greatness take shape, and faith becomes an unshakable foundation. Think of how many generations of people lived, loved, suffered, and hoped in these lands. How their aspirations, their prayers, their battles merged into a single fabric of history, woven from pain and joy, from failure and rebirth. Jerusalem is a living chronicle of the human soul, etched in stone and in memory. In this morning light, when the shadows still stretch long and the sounds of the city are just beginning to awaken, we stand on the threshold of a great narrative, a tale of a city that became a dream come true, of a people whose faith was forged in trials, and of a time when the world stood on the threshold of miracles. This is a story that began with dawn, with the first glimmer of hope illuminating the ancient hills of the Holy Land. And this dawn, bright and promising, marked the beginning of the journey we begin to explore today. The land, once divided among tribes, now pulses as a single heart. This is Jerusalem, and its rhythm is set by King Solomon. His name alone sounds like a promise of peace and prosperity. He inherits the kingdom not after lengthy battles, but after the wise choice of his father, King David. In his hands lies not only the scepter, but also the weight of responsibility for his people, for their spiritual and material well-being. Solomon's first steps on the throne are marked not by the thunder of arms, but by the whisper of prayer. He asks God not for wealth or power over his enemies, but for wisdom. Wisdom to judge his people, to discern right from wrong. And this request, so humble and profound, marks the beginning of his golden age. Heaven seems to bend, heeding this sincere desire to serve. And so, as if by magic, Jerusalem is transformed. The hands of builders, guided by genius and inspiration, labor tirelessly. This is not simply the construction of fortress walls or palaces. This is the creation of a dwelling place for the divine presence. The greatest design is the temple, a temple that will become not only the center of religious life, but also a symbol of unity, a shrine to which the gaze of all believers will be directed. Stones brought from distant mountains, wood shipped from Lebanon, gold shining brighter than the sun, all come together to form a majestic structure. Every element, every detail carries meaning, honed by centuries of tradition, and a new prophetic vision. This is a place where the heavenly is destined to touch the earthly, where prayers will be heard and rituals will take on a new dimension. The temple's architecture is astounding. Tall columns stand guard at the entrance. Inside, luxury and austerity reign, with gold and precious stones shimmering in the light of oil lamps. But the most important thing is not its external beauty, but its purpose. It is home to the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred relic that holds the tablets of the commandments. This is the place where God promised to dwell among his people. When the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the Holy of Holies, the air seemed to freeze. The crowds of people who had come for the dedication stood in reverent silence. Sunbeams streaming through specially created windows illuminated the golden coverings, filling the space with an unearthly light. The sound of trumpets merged with the voices of thousands of people offering praise. It was a moment when faith took physical form, when the invisible became tangible. But Solomon's golden age is not just about construction. It is a flourishing of culture, wisdom, and trade. Caravans arrive from distant lands, bringing exotic goods, ivory, gold, spices. Jerusalem becomes the center of the world, a destination for merchants, sages, and ambassadors. The royal treasury is full, and the people live in prosperity. Solomon writes his books, filled with reflections on life, meaning, and the human soul. His wisdom becomes legendary. Even the Queen of Sheba comes to test him and see for herself the greatness of his kingdom and his intellect. She sees not only wealth, but also order, justice, and the spiritual depth that permeates all aspects of life. During this period, the people of Israel attained unprecedented unity. The 12 tribes, once disunited, were now united under a single king and a single faith. The temple became their common home, their spiritual center. Prayers offered here were woven into a single thread, connecting past, present, and future. However, behind the glittering facade of the Golden Age, the seeds of future trials lurked. Even in the days of greatest prosperity, Solomon's wisdom warned, "All is vanity." He saw how easily wealth can corrupt and power can blind. His heart, once full of devotion, eventually began to seek solace in numerous wives from foreign nations. And their influence, their idols, began to penetrate the very heart of Israel, threatening the purity of the faith. This is the fine line Solomon walked. He built the temple, but couldn't fully protect it from the shadows. He gathered the people, but couldn't protect them from temptation. His wisdom, like his wealth, proved less than an absolute shield. And although his reign is considered golden, it already laid the foundations for future divisions and sorrows. But while the sun still shines and the temple walls shine, the people live in hope. Hope that this golden age will last forever, that the peace and prosperity granted by God will never fade. They believe in the wisdom of their king, in the impregnability of their walls, in the sanctity of their temple. And this light of faith, bright and powerful, illuminates the path forward, promising greatness and glory. The wind, carrying the scent of incense from the temple, fills the streets of Jerusalem. It whispers of glory, wisdom, and the divine presence. This is a time when history seemed to stand still in its triumphal march, when the people felt chosen, blessed, standing at the pinnacle of the world. The greatness of Solomon and his works became the embodiment of their own strength and faith, laying a foundation that, it seemed, would stand forever. A change of era approaches, like a breath of wind across the steppe, carrying with it the whisper of change. In the Holy Land, under the golden dome of the Jerusalem temple, the people of Israel are finding unity. The 12 tribes, once disparate, are now woven into a single fabric, woven from a shared faith and common destinies. The path to royal power and independence was long, marked by toil and sacrifice, but now, under wise leadership, It leads to prosperity. Each tribe brought its gift, its strength to the common treasury. The Jews, renowned for their steadfastness, brought loyalty. The tribe of Ephraim, wisdom and crafts. The tribe of Benjamin, military prowess. They became one family, one fortress, standing in defense of their land and their God. Jerusalem, the heart of this united nation, pulsated with life, its streets filled with the voices of merchants, the laughter of children, and the prayers of the faithful. It was a time when history seemed frozen before the storm, when every step forward was filled with confidence. The image of a single people, united under the scepter of a single king, became a symbol of their strength. They saw themselves as children of Abraham, called to greatness, a people destined to leave their mark on the ages. The wind blowing from the mountain peaks carried the scent of wormwood and rosemary, mingling with the aroma of incense from the temple, creating the unique spirit of the land. The footsteps of travelers heading toward the shrine echoed on the stone pavements. Their faces were illuminated by the soft light reflecting off the white walls of the houses. Every family, every home contributed to this common cause. Craftsmen honed their skills, farmers reaped bountiful harvests, and warriors stood guard at the borders, ready to defend their homes from any threat. A unity of purpose was felt in every glance, in every word. A sense of independence, like a sip of pure water after a long journey, filled their hearts. This was not just political freedom, but also the freedom to follow their own laws and their own faith. Jerusalem became not only the capital, but also a spiritual center, a magnet drawing all the sons of Israel. Its walls, erected with great labor, became a symbol of their fortitude and steadfastness. But even in the days of greatest triumph, the memory of past wanderings remained vivid. It served as a reminder of the price paid for the unity and independence they had gained. This knowledge gave special value to every day lived, every moment of peace. The legacy of our fathers, their struggle and their faith, became an invisible thread connecting the past with the present with the future. The breath of the wind, carrying the dust of roads and the scent of blooming gardens, whispered of a great destiny. At that moment, when the 12 tribes became a single people, when the royal power had acquired its strength, the future seemed cloudless. The inhabitants of Jerusalem, standing at the foot of the temple, sensed the nearness of the divine. This light, emanating from the sanctuary, illuminated the path ahead, promising greatness and glory. Time flowed like a river, carrying away days and years, but the memory of this period, of solidarity and unity, remained forever. It became the foundation for future achievements, a source of strength in difficult times. The image of a united people, united by their faith and their land, was carved into the heart of history, an unshakable monument to their quest for freedom. Each dawn over Jerusalem brought a new promise, a new breath of life. The city streets filled with the sounds of an awakening world. The voices of people rushing about their business mingled with the songs of birds. The marketplaces echoed with the hubbub of merchants offering their wares. It was a world built on a solid foundation of faith and unity, a world where everyone felt part of something greater. Traders from distant lands brought their exotic wares, enriching the city's culture and life. Artisans honed their skills, creating masterpieces that would delight posterity. Children played in the courtyards, their laughter echoing through the narrow streets, filling the air with joy. It was a picture of complete prosperity, a picture of a people who had found their place in the sun. But even in this golden age, the seeds of future trials had already been sown. Solomon's wisdom, great as it was, could not foresee every twist of fate. And though the people were united and the royal power strong, the fragility of human nature always remained a source of potential fractures. The wind that now carried incense might one day also carry ashes. The sense of stability they experienced was like the calm surface of a lake before a sudden storm. No one knew that this period of prosperity, this path to royal power and independence, was merely one stage in a greater history, a history full of ups and downs. But while the sun shone over Jerusalem, the people lived in hope, drawing strength from their unity and their faith. With each passing day, Jerusalem grew and developed, becoming a beacon for the entire nation. Its walls, like an embrace, protected its inhabitants. Its temple, like a heart, beat to the rhythm of shared prayer. And when the 12 tribes felt themselves to be one people, they saw in it a reflection of God's plan. This path to greatness was a path to themselves, to their true purpose. The voices of the prophets, though rare during this period, were already beginning to be heard, reminding us of the need to remain faithful to the covenants. But their words, like a quiet whisper amid the general jubilation, did not always find the desired response. The people were enjoying the fruits of their labor, their faith, their independence. And this light, bright and dazzling, eclipsed the shadows that were already beginning to gather on the horizon. The path to royal power had been traversed. The people had gained their independence. Jerusalem had become the center of their world. But this was only the beginning. History continued its inexorable march, bringing with it both great achievements and difficult trials. And this wind of change, barely perceptible now, would soon gather strength to change everything. The sun that once bathed Jerusalem in gold began to cast long shadows. Prosperity, so desired and so fragile, seemed to have reached its zenith. But it is precisely at such moments that the calm before the storm becomes especially palpable. Kings sat on their thrones, their hands grasping scepters, their minds preoccupied with the affairs of the kingdom. But beyond the glitter of royal robes, beyond the din of festivities and marketplaces, other voices were heard, voices that carried not praise, but warning. Prophets. They stood at crossroads, their gaze fixed on the distance, where trials loomed. They saw what others missed, heard what was drowned out by the noise of life. Their words were like stones dropped into calm water, causing ripples on the surface, disrupting the usual flow. They spoke of covenants, of faithfulness, of the path chosen by the people. But this path, as it turned out, was neither straight nor easy. They recalled a time when the people were but a flock led through the desert, when every decision was a matter of survival and every prayer a plea for protection. Then every word of God, delivered through the prophets, was law, carved into the heart. Now, when power and wealth seemed immutable, when the walls of Jerusalem seemed impregnable, these reminders sounded like discord. One prophet, his eyes filled with sorrow, cried out to the king, "Your hand holds the crown, but your thoughts are far from the people. You build palaces, but forget those who build your houses. Where is the justice that was promised?" Another, standing among the crowd, exclaimed, "You have been sated and have forgotten hunger. You have found peace and have forgotten fear. But God sees the heart, and he will not be pleased when your hearts are filled with pride and not humility." Their words, sometimes harsh, sometimes sad, did not always find an audience. The kings, surrounded by courtiers who whispered sweet words to them, preferred to hear what pleased their ears. The people, caught up in their daily concerns, their joys and sorrows, were not always ready to stop and listen to voices bearing messages of doubt. But the prophets did not give up. They saw how a people, once united in their desire for freedom, began to fragment. They saw how the faith that had been their support was being replaced by rituals devoid of true meaning. They saw how greed and the desire for power overshadowed the values that had made them strong. "Look around you," came their insistent cry. "Your hands, which held weapons for defense, now reach for what belongs to others. Your hearts, which beat in unison with God, now seek earthly goods. You have forgotten who you are. You have forgotten where you came from." These voices of doubt, these calls to repentance, were like the quiet but insistent tolling of a bell. They warned of impending disaster, that even the strongest kingdom could fall if its foundations proved unsound. They spoke of true strength not being found in gold or armies, but in fidelity to covenants and purity of heart. Some listened. Small groups of people, their eyes reflecting the same sorrow as the prophets, began to ponder. They saw the world around them changing, how the familiar foundations were beginning to waver. They felt the invisible threads connecting them to God fraying. But most remained deaf. They lived in the moment, enjoying the fruits of their labor, their independence. They believed that their kingdom, built on such a solid foundation, could not collapse. They were confident in their strength, in their righteousness. It was at this time, when the voices of doubt grew ever louder and calls for repentance remained unheard, that history was preparing its next most dramatic turn. It was a time when nations seemed to stand at the pinnacle, but were unaware of the abyss yawning at their feet. A time when kings ruled, but failed to hear the voice of truth. A time when prophets spoke, but their words were lost in the din of worldly vanity. And this was the beginning of the end of an era that seemed eternal. A change of era approaches, like a breath of wind across the steppe, bringing with it the echoes of coming changes. Solomon's kingdom, once united and strong, began to feel a subterranean tremor. The earth, seemingly unshakable, began to crack beneath the feet of those who lived within its embrace. And these were not cracks visible to the eye, but rather subtle, barely perceptible ruptures in the very fabric of existence, in the unity of the people. The 12 tribes, once united under the banner of a single king, now began to feel their paths diverging, the threads that bound them growing thinner. Jerusalem, the heart of the country, still beat mightily, but its throb now echoed with uneasy notes. Solomon's glory, which had elevated the kingdom to the heavens, was no longer enough to keep it from falling. The gold that adorned the temples and the wisdom that reigned in their halls could not silence the growing discord. Division, like a shadow gliding across the floor, began to descend upon the land. At first, it was merely a hint, a whisper in the corridors of power, discontent in distant provinces. But this whisper gradually gained strength, turning into a rumble that could no longer be ignored. The kingdom, once a model of unity, was now ready to split. Just as a dilapidated house begins to crumble with time, its foundation no longer as strong as it once was, so too the state began to succumb to internal pressure. 80 years after Solomon's death, around 931 BCE, that fateful schism occurred. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, ruled with firmness, but his harshness and intransigence were the spark that lit the long smoldering fuse. When he refused to listen to the people's pleas, when he answered their entreaties with a stern warning, the echo of his words reverberated across the land like thunder. 10 tribes, their hearts filled with resentment and disappointment, turned away from Jerusalem, from the royal house of David. They departed, leaving only 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, to stand by Jerusalem. Thus arose the southern kingdom, Judah, and in the north, under the rule of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, the northern kingdom, Israel, was formed. This division was more than just a political event. It was a rupture in the very soul of the people. The loss of unity brought with it not only a territorial division, but also a spiritual one. The northern kingdom, isolated from Jerusalem, the central place of worship, began to seek new paths. Jeroboam, fearing that his people, returning to Jerusalem to worship, might once again turn to the king of Judah, made a decision that forever changed the course of history. He erected 2 golden calves, one in Bethel and the other in Dan, and commanded the people to worship them. This was a direct violation of the covenant, a step toward idolatry, which the prophets had foretold as the greatest sin. The walls of Jerusalem, once seemingly immovable, now concealed a schism that harbingered the calamities to come. The Holy Land, once united under a wise king, was now split in 2, like a broken mirror, reflecting only fragments of its former glory. The northern kingdom of Israel sank ever deeper into the abyss of idolatry. Its kings succeeded one another, often through murder and conspiracy, and each new reign brought only greater lawlessness and apostasy. The prophets, those voices of truth resounding in the desert and in the public squares, called for repentance. They denounced impiety and predicted God's wrath. But their words were often drowned out by the din of riotous celebrations and the rustling of coins that had become the symbol of a new false faith. The southern kingdom of Judea, though it remained faithful to Jerusalem and the temple, was not free from sin. Division weakened it, making it vulnerable to external enemies. The kings of Judea, though they tried to maintain order, often succumbed to temptation, forgetting the covenants of their ancestors. They formed alliances with pagan peoples, seeking support from those who did not share their faith, and this became another step on the path to ruin. Between these two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, not only political but also moral chasms were growing. Each kingdom, isolated and often hostile to the other, became easier to subjugate. The Assyrian Empire, powerful and ruthless, watched this division closely. Its eyes, like birds of prey, were on the lookout for weakness, an opportunity for invasion. The Assyrians, skilled warriors and skilled conquerors, saw in the fragmented land an opportunity to expand their influence. Events unfolded rapidly, like the waters of a river overflowing its banks. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians. King Sargon II, majestic and unwavering, destroyed Samaria, the capital of Israel, and carried its inhabitants into captivity. This was the first great calamity, the first sign that ancient prophecies were beginning to come true. The 10 tribes, scattered across foreign lands, lost their identity, becoming the lost tribes. Their history, their songs, their faith all began to dissolve in the maelstrom of foreign cultures. The fall of Israel was a dire warning for Judah. Now it stood alone, confronting the growing might of Assyria. Jerusalem, the heart of the kingdom, was beating with increasing anxiety. The shadows of Babylon, not yet at its zenith, but already gaining strength. A new, darker era was approaching. The schism, which had once seemed merely a temporary inconvenience, turned into a catastrophe, a harbinger of the coming calamities that were to befall the land. The winds of change, which had begun as a gentle breeze, were turning into a storm, bringing destruction and sorrow, and no one knew when this era of trials would end. The night silence of Judea seemed heavy, filled with the whisper of anxiety. After the fall of the northern kingdom, after the 10 tribes had vanished into the Assyrian shadow, the southern kingdom of Judea remained a lonely bastion of faith. The walls of Jerusalem seemed to tremble under the weight of impending events. But even in this gloomy atmosphere, where the wind brought news of destruction, a spark of hope was born. It was a hope nourished by faith and the memory of glorious days. The time of exile, the time when the people of Israel were scattered across foreign lands, left deep scars. But it also forged the spirit, strengthening the connection with God and the homeland. Returning from Babylonian captivity, the exiles carried in their hearts images of the lost temple, the sounds of prayer, the taste of their native land. They carried with them not only grief, but also determination. A determination to restore what had been destroyed, to rebuild anew, to strengthen faith. Every stone laid in its place, every house rebuilt, every lesson learned. All of this was a step toward rebirth. Jerusalem began to regain its shape. The return was a long, arduous journey. Not everyone was able to return. Not everyone found their former place. But those who did brought with them not only building skills, but also spiritual strength. They built not just walls of stone, they built walls of faith, walls that would protect them from further disasters. Prophets, whose voices sounded like thunder from a clear sky, guided them, reminding them of the covenants, the importance of purity of heart and righteousness. The rebuilding of the temple became the central event of this period. It was not simply a return to its former splendor. It was a new beginning, sanctified by sacrifice and prayer. The walls of Jerusalem grew, but more importantly, the walls of faith grew in the hearts of the people. They learned to value peace, to value unity, to value their connection with God. After long years of dispersal, humiliation, and loss, the people were regaining their identity. It was a time when hope, like a tender shoot, broke through the ashes, promising a new dawn. Each new day brought not only labor, but also a sense of accomplishment. Each dawn over the rebuilt city reminded them that even after the darkest night, light comes. And this light was imbued with faith, which became their anchor in the turbulent sea of history. The wind that once brought news of destruction now seemed to whisper words of comfort and promise. They stood on the threshold of a new era, grounded in the past, but reaching toward the future with renewed faith. Time flowed like water in an ancient spring, washing the stones of history. After long years of wandering, after the shadows of captivity and the bitterness of loss, the people once again found their breath in the land of their ancestors. The rebuilt walls of Jerusalem welcomed their children like an embrace. The temple, the heart of the city, once again raised its vaults to the sky, filling the air with song and prayer. It was a time when hope, fragile yet stubborn, took root in hearts. Each dawn over the holy city was a promise, a quiet whisper of the future. The wind, bringing the scent of spices from the eastern bazaars and coolness from the mountain peaks, also carried news of changes brewing in the distance. The people lived, worked, and believed. But this faith, this newfound stability, held something more than a simple restoration of the past. It was an expectation that lasted for centuries, permeating every line of sacred scripture, every breath of the prophets. It was an expectation of the one who would change the course of time, who would bring light to a world drowning in shadows. Jerusalem, like a sentinel, stood on the threshold of a new era, its stones preserving the memory of past centuries, and the souls of its inhabitants filled with a premonition of the future. Amid the bustle of everyday life, amid the cries of the marketplace and the clatter of artisans, voices rang out, speaking of the Messiah, of God's anointed one, whose coming would mark a new chapter in human history. These words, like seeds falling on the fertile soil of faith, sprouted in hearts, nourishing hope for deliverance, for justice, for the peace promised long ago. Jerusalem, A city that had seen so many kings and so much destruction now witnessed a quiet but powerful awakening. The city's walls, built with such love and perseverance, seemed not just a defense against external enemies, but also a symbol of inner readiness, a readiness to accept what was to come. People looked to the stars for signs, listened to the rustling of leaves for answers. 2,000 years is a long time to wait, a time that could break even the most steadfast spirit. But the faith of the people of Israel, forged in the crucible of trials, only grew stronger. It became the invisible thread that bound generations, carrying within itself the light of ancient promises. There was something special in the air, elusive yet palpable. It was the anticipation of a miracle, mingled with anxiety. The world was far from perfect. The Roman Empire, like a mighty but merciless octopus, had spread its tentacles, subjugating nations. In Judea, though under Roman rule, the memory of former greatness, of freedom, of divine destiny lived on. This memory, like smoldering embers, was ready to flare up at any moment. And so, amid this complex mosaic of history, amid expectations and anxieties, amidst light and shadow, something began to happen that would change the world forever. The time had come when the ancient prophecies began to come true. Not as many expected, not with thunder and lightning, not with the appearance of a heavenly host, but quietly, modestly, in a small town at the foot of the mountains. This wasn't simply the coming of a new king or a new leader. It was something far deeper, more all-encompassing. It was the beginning of a new era, the birth of a light that would dispel the thickest clouds of ignorance and fear. Jerusalem, a city that had witnessed so many eras, became the unwitting but great keeper of this secret. Its streets, its squares, its temples, all were poised to become the arena for events whose echoes would resound through the centuries. 2,000 years of waiting is more than just a number. It represents millions of hearts filled with hope. It represents countless prayers raised to heaven. It represents a faith that never faded despite all trials. And so, this faith, this hope, this expectation brought the world to a standstill without even realizing it. Everything was ready. The light was at the threshold. The coming of the Messiah was not an instantaneous event visible at a glance. It was a gradual unfolding, like the sunrise, which at first merely paints the horizon with delicate colors, then floods the world with its golden light. His words, his deeds, his very essence began to permeate the fabric of reality, transforming it from within. In Jerusalem, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and the salt of eternal tears, people began to talk of miracles, of the blind receiving their sight, of the lame walking, of the dead returning to life. These stories, initially whispered from mouth to mouth, began to spread like wildfire, igniting new sparks of faith. The Messiah came not with a sword, but with love, not with gold, but with truth. He brought a message not of conquest, but of the kingdom of heaven, which resides within each of us. He spoke of forgiveness, of mercy, of love for one's neighbor, even one's enemy. These words were revolutionary for a world accustomed to violence and revenge.
His teaching, like a pure spring, began to wash over people's souls, cleansing them of the filth of sin and ignorance. He did not destroy the law, but fulfilled it, imbuing it with new meaning. He showed that true righteousness lies not in the observance of external rituals, but in purity of heart and the fulfillment of God's will. Jerusalem, once the center of religious life, witnessed this new teaching spread beyond its borders. His disciples, simple fishermen and tax collectors, became bearers of this new message. They walked the roads, bringing the light of truth to the darkest corners of the earth. This was more than just a new religious movement. It was the birth of a new era, an era of grace and redemption. The Messiah, coming into the world, tore down the walls that divided people, walls between nations, between social classes, between sinners and the righteous. He showed that all people are equal before God, and that everyone can find salvation through faith in Him. The time of waiting was over. The time of action had begun. The time when the light of the Messiah began to dispel the darkness, when love began to conquer hatred, when hope began to replace despair. And it all began here, in the Holy Land, in the city that witnessed this great birth. The new era brought by the Messiah was more than just a change of seasons. It was a transformation of life itself. The teachings of love, forgiveness, and eternal life opened new horizons for humanity. People who had previously lived in fear and ignorance now found hope and meaning. Jerusalem, a city that had seen so many ups and downs, now became the cradle of a new faith. Its stones, its streets, its churches all bore witness to the dawn of a new age. 2,000 years of waiting had changed the world forever. This journey from the dawn of the Holy Land to the new era was long and eventful. It laid the foundation for what we know today. And this foundation, built on faith, hope, and love, stands to this day, a reminder that even the longest wait can end in the most beautiful dawn. The world, transformed by the message of the Messiah, continued its march. But beneath the surface of the new, heaven-stretched faith lay a land shackled by the chains of earthly power. The Holy Land, once the center of divine revelation, now felt the weight of the Roman boot. The empire, spreading its legions from the cold shores of Britain to the hot sands of Africa, brought with it order. But this order was forged in iron and blood. Taxes were collected inexorably, like the tides, draining the purses of the common people. Majestic roads built by Roman engineers linked distant provinces. But these same roads also brought soldiers ready to crush any disobedience. Jerusalem, a city whose history was written in the gold of faith and the blood of prophets, was now under foreign rule. The Temple Mount, the place where the glory of God was believed to reside, was guarded by Roman cohorts. The air was thick with the scent of incense and prayer, but also a subtle scent of fear brought from far away, from Rome. Life went on as usual, in bustling bazaars, in quiet synagogues, under a sun that shone equally on conquerors and conquered. But beneath this apparent stability, something else was brewing.
The hearts of many held memories of a time when their ancestors had forged their own destiny. Memories of Solomon, of David, of the times of independence, when the people's voices rang out freely, unmuffled by the trumpet blasts of the legions. This wasn't just discontent. It was a silent but deep wound inflicted on each generation by humiliating dependence. The Romans brought their laws, their customs, their religion, which, though not directly imposed, still felt alien. Whispers of discontent began to spread like the wind blowing dust across the desert. In Galilee, where the Messiah once preached, among the fishermen and farmers, discontent was particularly acute. In Judea, among the more conservative and religious classes, a sense of desecration of sacred things grew. Even far from bustling Jerusalem, in small villages, people recalled ancient promises of freedom, of a kingdom that would come not of this world, but would grant them dignity. These thoughts, these feelings, smoldered like sparks in the dry grass. No one spoke openly of rebellion, not yet. But in the eyes of the old men, in the wariness of the young, in the whispers that died down when a Roman patrol passed, tension was palpable. The empire was mighty. Its military machine seemed invincible. The legions, clad in armor, swords at the ready, represented a formidable force. But this strength was superficial. The strength hidden in the heart often proves far more resilient. During this period, when Judea was under Roman rule, a period of difficult coexistence ensued. The Roman administration, represented by its governors, strove to maintain order, collect taxes, and ensure loyalty. But for a people whose history was so closely tied to divine providence, this was a time of constant challenge. Every day was a reminder that they lived on land that had once been their own, but now belonged to someone else. However, despite the oppression of the empire, life did not stand still. The seeds of the new faith brought by the Messiah continued to sprout. The teachings of love, mercy, and the kingdom of God, which is not of this world, resonated in the hearts of many. And this spiritual uplift, this inner freedom gained through faith, became for some a source of strength, resisting external tyranny. People learned to distinguish between the earthly and the heavenly, the temporal and the eternal. But the reality on earth remained harsh. The weight of Roman rule was felt in every corner of the province. Legionnaires, their sandals leaving marks on the dusty roads, were a constant reminder of foreign power. Trade routes controlled by Rome brought revenue to the empire, but burdened the local population. The taxes levied to support the vast Roman apparatus seemed exorbitant. And so, in this atmosphere, where spiritual hope coexisted with the reality of earthly oppression, the first stirrings of resistance began to emerge. These weren't large-scale armies or organized uprisings, but rather isolated outbreaks, spontaneous expressions of discontent. Perhaps it was a dispute with a Roman tax collector that escalated into a fight. Perhaps it was open disobedience provoked by an unfair decision by a governor. These minor skirmishes, like the first flashes of lightning before a thunderstorm, foreshadowed the coming storm. In the hearts of many, the dream of freedom glimmered, the dream of the day when Judea would be free again, when the Jewish people could live by their own laws, under their own king.
This dream, fueled by history and faith, was the spark that could ignite the flame. And though Rome seemed an impregnable fortress, even the strongest walls can fall when attacked with sufficient force and persistence. Time passed and the tension grew. Each new Roman edict, each new act of arbitrary rule by the governor, like a drop falling into a full vessel, brought the moment closer when the cup of patience would overflow. People whose ancestors had witnessed the grandeur of Solomon's temple were now forced to see soldiers of a foreign army on their streets. This was more than just political domination. It was a test of faith, of identity, of the very soul of the people. It was during this period, when the weight of the empire was felt most keenly, and hope for a coming kingdom remained alive, that the long and painful road to open conflict began. Sparks of rebellion, still weak and scattered, began to flicker, foreshadowing the days when the quiet whispers of discontent would turn into a thunderous cry. The world stood still, not yet realizing that a new, tragic chapter of history was opening before it. Tension, like an invisible thread, hung taut over Judea. The air was thick with anxiety, thick as summer heat, mingled with the scent of dust and fear. Roman legionaries, clad in steel, strode along the cobbled streets of Jerusalem, their heavy footsteps echoing dully in the narrow alleys, a reminder of foreign rule. Every day brought new humiliations, new extortions that squeezed the last sap from the land and the people. The empire's coffers grew inexorably larger, while the hearts of the people were weighed down by bitterness. The temple, once filled with prayers and hymns, now felt different. The priests, clad in their ceremonial robes, performed the rites, but their eyes revealed not only devotion, but also despair. They saw how ancient traditions, sacred laws, passed down from generation to generation, were being tested. How the sanctity of the place was being desecrated by the presence of pagan banners. A whisper of discontent, at first quiet, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind, began to gain strength. It flowed from one house to another, from one synagogue to another, acquiring body and voice. Those who could bear it no longer arose among the people, those whose blood boiled with injustice. These were people of all walks of life, from farmers whose fields were subject to exorbitant taxes, to merchants whose caravans were stopped on the roads by Roman soldiers. They gathered secretly, away from prying eyes, in caves and secluded groves. Their faces were illuminated by the flickering light of torches, and their eyes burned with determination. Here bold plans were born. Here words were spoken that could change the course of history. Simeon bar Gilga, the son of a craftsman whose hands were accustomed to labor, was one of those who ignited this fire. His voice, strong and confident, penetrated hearts. He spoke of the right to freedom, of duty to ancestors, of sacred land that must not be surrendered to the enemy. Others stood by his side. Yochanan ben Zakkai, a sage whose words were based on knowledge of laws and prophecies, and Eleazar ben Azariah, whose courage was as great as his faith.
They understood that Rome was a powerful enemy, whose army was like an inexorable storm. But they also knew that even the most violent storm eventually subsides, and rocks cast into the sea remain unshakable. The governor, Marcus Antonius Felix, viewed these beginnings of resistance with disdain. He considered the Jews a rebellious, stubborn people whose ambitions were laughable in the face of the empire's might. He strengthened the garrison and tightened control, believing that fear was the best way to tame the rebellious spirit. But his actions only added fuel to the fire. Every new order, every act of cruelty was perceived as a personal insult, a challenge. The tension was mounting. A sense of inevitability hung in the air. Just as the sky darkens most intensely before dawn, so too did the sense of impending doom grow before a great upheaval. The streets were less cheerful, less laughing. People walked with their heads bowed, but in their eyes burned that same fire that could not be extinguished. At this time, when Rome seemed all-powerful and hope as fragile as a butterfly's wing, the people of Judea began to prepare for the most important thing: to fight. A fight for their faith, for their land, for their future. It was a time when quiet whispers turned into thunderous cries, when fear gave way to desperate courage. No one yet knew at what price this struggle would be purchased, or what wounds would remain in hearts for centuries to come. But the decision had been made, and it was irreversible. The year 66, according to the Roman calendar, had arrived. The time had come when the cup of patience had run over. The trigger, as often happens, was a seemingly insignificant event. In Caesarea, a city where the Jewish population constituted a minority, a conflict broke out between Greek and Jewish residents. The Romans, called upon to maintain order, sided with the Greeks. This was the final straw. A wave of violence swept through the city. Jewish quarters were looted, and synagogues were desecrated. News of these events spread like wildfire. It reached Jerusalem, where the embers of discontent had long been smoldering. In the temple, where a multitude had gathered for the feast, a commotion broke out. The priests, hearing of the atrocities in Caesarea, raised their voices. They spoke of dishonor, of injustice, of the need to defend their people. At that moment, as emotions overwhelmed everyone, one of the priests, Yochanan ben Gilga, rose to the steps of the temple. His face was pale, but his eyes blazed with determination. He called on the people to rise up. He called on them to take up arms and repel the enemy. His words, spoken with such passion, resonated with thousands. The crowd, gripped by a single impulse, roared. It wasn't just a shout. It was a roar. The roar of a people who could no longer bear it. On that same day, at that same hour, something happened that astonished even the Romans. The garrison stationed in the Antonia fortress, guarding the temple, consisted of 10 cohorts. The Jews, armed with everything they could, from swords and spears to stones and sticks, rushed to the assault. The Romans, accustomed to discipline and order, were caught off guard. They had not expected such fury, such desperate courage. The battle was brutal. The air was filled with the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the death rattles. But the Jewish people stood united. Farmers, artisans, merchants, they all fought side by side.
They were driven not only by hatred for their oppressors, but also by a deep love for their land and their faith. They remembered their ancestors who built this city and defended it from enemies. This spirit, this memory, gave them strength. A few days later, after a fierce and bloody battle, the Roman garrison was forced to retreat. Fort Antonia fell. It was the rebels' first major victory. News of it spread throughout Judea like the wind carrying seeds. Revolts erupted everywhere. Cities under Roman rule rose in revolt. In Joppa, Masada, and other fortresses, the Jews smashed Roman garrisons and expelled their governors. Rome, shocked by this sudden and powerful rebellion, responded immediately. Emperor Nero, realizing the scale of the threat, dispatched one of his finest armies to Judea under the command of the experienced general Vespasian. He was soon joined by his son Titus. They arrived with orders to suppress the rebellion at all costs. A period had arrived when the silence was deceptive. It concealed the roar of the approaching battle. The people who had defied the empire knew that terrible trials lay ahead. But they also knew that there was no turning back. They had made their choice, a choice that would determine their fate and the fate of the entire Jewish people. Courage, born of despair, became their greatest weapon. And this courage, no matter how tragic its price, will forever remain etched in history. Vespasian, having arrived in Judea, began a methodical offensive. His army, seasoned in battle, acted with cold, calculating precision. He did not seek quick victories, but preferred a slow but steady advance, gradually subjugating cities and fortresses. The rebels, lacking a centralized command and a regular army, attempted to resist, but the odds were too unequal. Cities fell one after another. Galilee, a rich and densely populated region, was the first to fall. Vespasian, using his superior might, besieged cities, destroyed their fortifications, and exterminated the population. In each act of suppression, in each burned village, in each spilled blood, the Romans sought to sow fear and break the will to resist. But the Jewish people, even in the most difficult circumstances, did not lose hope. Inside besieged cities, people, exhausted by hunger and deprivation, continued to fight. They saw this not simply as a war for independence, but also as a struggle for their faith, for their right to live by their own laws. The prophets, whose voices had resounded even in the time of the kings, seemed to come alive again in the hearts of the people. Their words of faith, of fortitude, of coming redemption, buoyed the spirits of those who had found themselves on the brink of despair. However, reality was cruel. The Roman military machine was relentless. It crushed resistance like a millstone. Vespasian, demonstrating his efficiency, managed to take control of most of the country in a short time. Only Jerusalem remained, the heart of Judea, the last citadel of hope. Tension reigned within the city. Famine and disease were beginning to take their toll. Yet, despite this, the residents of Jerusalem prepared for defense. They knew the full might of the Roman Empire would descend upon them. But they also knew that this city was more than just a fortress.
It was a sacred place, a symbol of their people and their faith. The year 69 arrived. Vespasian, having received news of Nero's death and the outbreak of civil war in Rome, was forced to leave command to his son Titus. Titus, young and ambitious, was eager to complete his work and earn glory. He assembled a massive army, consisting of 4 legions, and marched on Jerusalem. The city was surrounded. The Romans had begun a siege that would become one of the longest and bloodiest in history. The air above Jerusalem was filled with a sense of foreboding. The streets, once teeming with life, were now deserted. Only shadows flitted across the walls, reflecting fear and uncertainty. The city's inhabitants, locked in their homes, prayed, hoping for a miracle. They knew that a trial lay ahead, perhaps the most terrible in their history. They had defied a mighty empire, and now they would learn the true price of such insolence. The air over Jerusalem thickened, becoming dense, like an invisible shroud. Every breath seemed like a premonition of something irreversible. The Roman legions, like living steel, surrounded the city. Their orderly ranks, their shields polished to a mirror shine, reflected the sparse sun, casting glimmers on the cracked stones of the ancient walls. Titus, a young commander whose name was already whispered throughout the capital, stood on a hill, peering into the heart of the resistance. His eyes betrayed impatience, a thirst for glory, but also, perhaps, a shadow of understanding of what was to come. The siege had begun. The first stones, hurled from the catapults, cut through the air with a menacing whistle. They struck the walls, causing dull thuds, echoing in the narrow streets. Jerusalem, once radiant, now breathed anxiety. Inside, behind the thick walls, hunger had already begun its sinister dance. Food had become a luxury, water a precious commodity. But the spirit of the people who had stood on this land for centuries was unbroken. The defenders, exhausted but determined, prepared to meet the enemy. Every house, every tower became part of the defensive line. They knew they were fighting not just for the city, but for their very souls, for the memory of their ancestors, for the future of their children. Day turned to night, and night to day, but the whistle of shells and the rumble of siege engines never ceased. The Romans methodically, step by step, approached. Their engineers built siege ramparts, raising them to the very sky. Wood creaked under the onslaught, the earth trembled. But the inhabitants of Jerusalem responded with a hail of arrows and stones. The walls, which had witnessed so many centuries, now bore witness to a desperate struggle. At times, in brief moments of calm, all that could be heard was the moan of the wind sweeping across the empty squares, or the muffled voices of prayer echoing from beneath the vaults of the temple. Hope seemed to be fading, like a candle in a draught. But in the hearts of those who believed, it continued to smolder. Titus watched. His army, disciplined and strong, was ready for the final assault. He saw the flame of resistance fading, but he did not see it extinguished completely. The city, surrounded on all sides, seemed doomed. Time slowed, as if the entire history of the world stood frozen before the inevitable. The moment had arrived when resistance became almost impossible. The Roman soldiers, driven by a thirst for victory and command, began the final assault. They poured through the breaches in the walls like seething lava. Screams, the clash of metal, the clanking of shields, all mingled in a hellish chorus. The defenders, despite fatigue and wounds, fought with the fury of the doomed. Every meter of ground, every step the enemy took, cost them blood. But the Romans' numerical superiority was overwhelming. The legionaries, with their honed tactics and iron will, relentlessly advanced. They brought fire and destruction with them. Flames engulfed the wooden structures, sending black clouds of smoke rising into the sky. The heat was so intense that it seemed the sun itself bowed over the city in mourning. Titus, standing on the wall, saw Jerusalem ablaze. His gaze fell upon the majestic temple. It was the heart of the city, the heart of the people, the heart of faith. Despite the orders, or perhaps because of their ambiguity, the fire began to creep up on the sacred walls. Sparks, caught by the wind, circled above like angry birds. The fire, unstoppable, began to devour the ancient stones. The golden ornaments of the temple melted. Rivers of molten metal flowed down the facade. Smoke blinded the eyes. The smell of burning penetrated the soul. The majestic structure, which had stood for centuries, was now reduced to smoldering ruins. Flames, a fiery sword, cut through the sky, leaving behind only ash and sorrow. Wall after wall, tower after tower, the city fell. Roman soldiers, devastated by the battle, but triumphant, walked through streets that had recently been full of life. Each step of their heavy boots sounded like the death knell of a lost era. The hope that had flickered in the hearts of the inhabitants burned in this flame. Great Jerusalem, the center of spiritual life, the symbol of unity, lay in ruins. Its walls, witnesses to so many events, were now scarred by the sword and scorched by fire. The wind swept over the ruins, whispering stories of former grandeur and a terrible end. The silence that followed the battle was deafening. It was the silence of desolation, a silence in which only grief echoed. Titus, looking at the ashes, perhaps realized that this victory had come at too high a price. The destruction of the temple, the sacred site, was more than just a military success. It was the destruction of a symbol, the end of an era. The fiery sword raised by Roman might had cut not only the flesh of the city, but also the fabric of time. The ancient world, with its faith and hope, its kings and prophets, was fading. Jerusalem, once radiant, was now only a shadow of its former self, a reminder of the strength and fragility of human aspirations. Smoke from the conflagration rose to the sky, like the last breath of a dying world. A new era was dawning, an era of ashes and exile. But within this grief, a quiet yet unquenchable hope was already brewing. All was lost, and yet, at the same time, everything was still possible. The city lay in ruins, but the memory of it, its grandeur and tragedy, remained forever in hearts. Now they were slashed by the sword and scorched by fire. The wind, sweeping over the ruins, whispered stories of past glory and a terrible end. The silence that followed the battle was deafening. It was the silence of desolation, a silence in which only grief resounded. Titus, looking at the ashes, perhaps realized that this victory had come at too high a price. The destruction of the temple, a sacred site, was more than just a military success. It was the destruction of a symbol, the end of an era. The fiery sword raised by Roman might had cut not only the flesh of the city, but the fabric of time. The ancient world, with its faith and hope, its kings and prophets, was declining. Jerusalem, once radiant, was now only a shadow of its former self, a reminder of the strength and fragility of human aspirations. Smoke from the conflagration rose to the sky like the last breath of a dying world. A new era was dawning, an era of ashes and exile. But within this grief, a quiet yet unquenchable hope was already ripening. All was lost, and yet, at the same time, everything was still possible. The city lay in ruins, but the memory of it, its grandeur and tragedy, remained forever in hearts. Now they were slashed by the sword and scorched by fire. The wind, sweeping over the ruins, whispered stories of past glory and a terrible end. The silence that followed the battle was deafening. It was the silence of desolation, a silence in which only grief resounded. Titus, looking at the ashes, perhaps realized that this victory had come at too high a price. The destruction of the temple, a sacred site, was more than just a military success. It was the destruction of a symbol, the end of an era. The fiery sword raised by Roman might had cut not only the flesh of the city, but the fabric of time. The ancient world with its faith and hope, its kings and prophets, was declining. Jerusalem, once radiant, was now only a shadow of its former self, a reminder of the strength and fragility of human aspirations. Smoke from the conflagration rose to the sky like the last breath of a dying world. A new era was dawning, an era of ashes and exile. But within this grief, a quiet yet unquenchable hope was already ripening. All was lost, and yet, at the same time, everything was still possible. The city lay in ruins, but the memory of it, its grandeur and tragedy, remained forever in hearts. Smoke rose into the sky, thick and acrid, like the last breath of a dying world. It enveloped the remains of what had once been Greater Jerusalem, blurring the boundaries between earth and heaven. The fire that had consumed the sacred walls died down, leaving behind only charred remains and ashes. This ash, light and weightless, swirled in the air, settling on the faces of the survivors like a shroud of grief. The wind, once gentle, now howled through the empty doorways, bringing with it the smell of burning and despair. The city, the heart of an ancient land, lay in ruins. Its grandeur, built over centuries of faith and labor, had crumbled to dust. The temple, the center of the world, the meeting place of man and God, lay in ruins. The sanctuary where prayers were resounded and sacrifices were offered had fallen victim to cruelty.
The Roman legionaries, the victors, moved amid the rubble with a look of devastation. Their eyes, so recently ablaze with the lust for battle, now revealed something else, the weight of what had been accomplished. They saw not just a vanquished enemy, but the end of an era. The exile had begun. Those who had miraculously escaped sword and fire now trudged away from their hometown. Their homes were ashes, their holy places in ruins. In their hands they carried only what they could carry, pitiful belongings, images of what had been lost. Their path lay into the unknown, into foreign lands, where every step was filled with the pain of loss. The sounds of wailing mingled with the rustle of footsteps, creating a mournful melody of exile. Women with children in their arms, old men leaning on staffs, young men with dull eyes, all were part of a great tragedy. Each of them carried in their hearts the image of Jerusalem, the city that was their home, their destiny. Now that image was darkened by ash and grief. They departed, leaving behind not only stones and walls, but their very identity, torn from its roots. The air was thick with not only the smell of burning, but also something elusive, the weight of unspoken words, unfulfilled hopes. It was as if the city itself, dying, sighed, mourning its children. Every stone, every crack in the ground seemed to hold memories of the past, of days when the sun illuminated the golden domes, when the sounds of music and prayer filled the streets. Now all of that was just a distant echo, buried beneath the rubble. But even in this pitch darkness, in this universal devastation, something new was being born, something that neither fire nor sword could destroy. It was memory. The memory of greatness, of faith, of unity. This memory, like a seed falling into the fertile soil of sorrow, began to sprout. It was fed by tears and blood, but it only grew stronger. The loss of Jerusalem wasn't just an end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a long, arduous journey. A journey that would be traversed by many generations. A journey that led through centuries, through distant lands and foreign times. A journey along which people scattered across the world would carry the fire of faith in their hearts. A fire that would never be extinguished as long as memory lived. Everyone who left the city took with them a piece of its soul. Images of the temple, the sound of the shofar, the taste of holy water. All of this became part of their inner being. They became bearers of history, keepers of covenants. Their exile was not only a punishment, but also a mission to preserve what had been bequeathed by their ancestors. The silence that followed the destruction was deceptive. It was the silence before a new storm, a silence in which the seeds of resistance were ripening. In the hearts of those who left, there was not only grief, but also determination. The determination to return. The determination to rebuild. The determination to restore what seemed irrevocably lost. Roman power established its dominance, but it could not extinguish the spark of hope. This spark, fueled by the memory of the past, will smolder in the hearts of the exiles. It will be passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. It will serve as a reminder that home exists, even if it lies in ruins. Jerusalem, the city that fell, lived on. It lived on in songs, in prayers, in dreams. It lived on in everyone who carried its name in their hearts. Its story was not over. It merely took on a new form, becoming a story of resilience and faith. The story of a people who, having lost everything, found something more precious, ineradicable hope. The wind continued its journey, scattering the seeds of grief and exile across the land. But along with them, it also carried the seeds of new life, a new faith. And somewhere out there, far away, under a foreign sky, people remembered their home. They remembered it with pain, but also with quiet determination. They knew that even ashes retain warmth, and ruins the promise of the future. And this journey, full of trials, was only just beginning. The last ray of sun faded over the devastated Jerusalem. Ash, thick and acrid, hung in the air, mingling with the smell of smoke and tears. Titus's soldiers, reveling in victory, carried their spoils, their heavy boots leaving marks on the sacred ground, now strewn with rubble and blood. Somewhere in the distance, on the hills, a wailing could be heard, like the groaning of the earth. But amidst this grief, deep in wounded hearts, something else was born. An ineradicable memory. A memory of golden domes, of the whispered prayers within the walls of the temple, of the voices of ancestors echoing in every song, in every tradition. This memory carried not only the pain of loss, but also a quiet but firm promise. A promise to return. A promise to rebuild. The exiles, scattered across the vast expanses of the empire, carried this fire within them. It smoldered in their eyes as they gazed at the alien sky, in their hands as they toiled on foreign soil. Every stone, every sound, every scent of their new homeland only intensified their longing for Jerusalem. In their dreams, it appeared in all its former splendor, shining, unharmed, calling them back. Waking, they felt bitterness, but this bitterness became fuel for their hope. They told their children of their city, its history, its sanctity, passing on to them not just words, but the living essence of home. Centuries passed, like waves washing onto the shore. Roman rule gave way to other empires. State borders were redrawn. But the people's pain and their connection to Jerusalem remained constant. This connection was immaterial, invisible, yet stronger than any steel. It lived in synagogues where ancient psalms resounded, in holidays celebrated with special solemnity, in the prohibition of certain actions that recalled the lost home. It was a bond woven from faith, grief, and unshakable hope. Time seemed to erase much, but it only strengthened this bond, making it even more precious. People born far from the Holy Land felt its call as keenly as their ancestors. They knew that somewhere out there, beyond the seas and mountains, lay their true home. They dreamed of the day when they could set foot on its soil, breathe its air, and see it again.
This dream was a beacon in their lives, a guiding star, guiding them through all difficulties and trials. Even those who had never seen Jerusalem with their own eyes felt its presence. It was in their blood, in their genes, in their collective memory. It was a sense of belonging to something great, ancient, sacred. It was the knowledge that despite all the losses, despite all the destruction, something important remained intact, something stronger than time and circumstance. And so, through the centuries, through wars and peace, through joy and sorrow, this bond grew stronger. It became an invisible thread stretching from every Jewish heart to the heart of Jerusalem. It was a thread woven from memories of the past, from the pain of the present, and from unquenchable hope for the future. This memory was not simply the burden of the past, but also the promise of rebirth. The promise that one day, when the time was right, they would return. Return to see the radiance of their home once again. The wind continued to carry its stories, but now it also carried echoes of ancient promises. Promises that lived in people's hearts like an eternal connection to a lost home. This connection was their strength, their comfort, their true legacy. It reminded them of who they were, where they came from, and where they aspired. It was living proof that even after the most terrible destruction, hope can rise from the ashes, and a home can live on in the heart, even if it lies in ruins. And this path, a path through the centuries, was the path to return. Even in the darkest times, when it seemed all was lost, they didn't forget. They remembered. And in that memory, like a quiet stream, flowed a life-giving force. A force that allowed them to move forward no matter what. A force that carried within it an eternal promise. The promise that one day, when dawn came, they would see their city again. Their Jerusalem. Their lost but forever beloved home. This connection was their shield, their faith, their compass. It guided them through all trials, reminding them that they were not alone, that their story continued, that their home awaited. And this hope, bright and pure, burned in their hearts like an eternal flame. They walked forward, carrying this light within them, the light of memory, the light of hope. And somewhere out there, on the horizon, loomed the image of the city that lived in their souls. A city that was not just a place on a map, but the embodiment of their identity, their faith, their dreams. This image was their guiding star, their eternal landmark. It was the promise of return, the promise of a new beginning, the promise that home, even lost, is never forgotten. It lives in every step, in every prayer, in every breath. And this eternal connection, strong as a rock, carried them through time. Through the centuries, through all the hardships, this bond remained unbroken. It was passed down from generation to generation, like a precious inheritance. Each new descendant, born far from the Holy Land, felt this call, this longing. They knew that somewhere out there, under the sun of another sky, lay their true home. And this thought, this hope, filled their hearts with strength. A strength that allowed them to endure, not break, to believe. to believe that one day they would return to see the walls of their city once again. Jerusalem, even in its ruins, remained a symbol of resilience, a symbol of faith, a symbol of an unwavering spirit. It was not just a city, but a living legend that continued to live in hearts and minds. A legend that nurtured hope and gave them the strength to move forward. The journey was long, but it was illuminated by the light of memory, a light that never faded, a light that led them home. Time flowed like a river, carrying away years, centuries, but the image of Jerusalem remained unchangeable in their hearts. It was carved there as if in stone. Every stone, every street, every corner held its own story. And these stories, passed down orally, became a part of them. They were the foundation of their identity, their support in this changing world. And somewhere there, deep within them, a spark of hope always burned. Hope for return, hope for rebirth. This spark, fueled by an eternal connection to their lost home, kept them burning. It was their inner compass, their guiding star. It reminded them of who they were and where they must return. And though the journey was long and fraught with trials, they moved forward. They moved forward, carrying in their hearts the image of a city that was everything to them. Their home, their faith, their hope. And this connection, eternal and unbreakable, was their greatest treasure. It was the promise of the future, forged in the crucible of the past. And so, as the last echoes of ancient times fade away like the whisper of the wind in a valley, we stand on the threshold of eternity. The history of Jerusalem, a city whose name is carved on the tablets of time, knows no end. It continues, living in every stone, in every prayer, in every breath. This is a city that was and remains not just a place on a map, but the pulse of history, the beating heart of humanity. From the greatness of Solomon, whose hands raised the temple shining in the sun, to the sorrow of exile, when the wind carried away the ashes, Jerusalem has witnessed and participated in great events. It has seen the birth of prophets, heard the voices of kings, felt the breath of empires. Its walls, destroyed and rebuilt, preserve the memories of countless generations. Every alley, every courtyard conceals stories of love and loss, faith and doubt, triumph and despair. They intertwine, creating a unique tapestry woven from destinies. Jerusalem is more than stone and wood. It is the breath of faith rising to the heavens, the quiet whisper of prayers carried over the hills. It is the reflection of stars in ancient wells, the echo of the footsteps of those who walked here before us. The city became a symbol, a beacon for those seeking their path. Its history is a chronicle of resilience, unwavering will, and eternal hope. Even in the darkest times, when the shadows seemed endless, the spark of faith never faded. It burned in hearts like an unquenchable flame, illuminating the path through the centuries. This light, inherited from ancestors, was passed down from generation to generation, reminding them of who they were and where they aspired. Jerusalem is a heritage that belongs to no one people or faith. It is part of a shared human memory, a treasure trove of spiritual experience. Its significance extends far beyond geographical boundaries. It lives in the stories mothers tell their children, in the songs sung by pilgrims, in the quiet reflections of everyone who touches its ancient mystery. Looking at it, we see not only the past, but also a reflection of the present and a premonition of the future.
The city, which has weathered so many storms, continues to stand like an ancient oak tree whose roots reach deep into the earth and whose branches reach toward the sky. Its history is a perpetual movement, a continuous flow of time, in which every moment has its own significance. And so, as we complete this journey, let only a feeling of peace and serenity remain. Let the image of Jerusalem, the city of eternal memory, fill our hearts with a quiet light. Let its history, like an ancient river, continue to flow, nourishing our souls and reminding us that true heritage is not only what we see, but also what we feel, what lives within us. It is the quiet sigh of an ancient world passing into eternity.